Many Fujifilm shooters believe that their camera's dynamic range settings only affect JPEGs and not RAW files. Well... Hi everyone and welcome to Pal to Tech. Most of the settings in the IQ section of your menu only affect JPEG files. But there is one setting right here that's the exception. Dynamic range, or DR, which gives you 4 options of auto, 100%, 200%, and 400%. These dynamic range settings are designed to solve one specific problem, where the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows are just too far apart for the camera to be able to capture both of them well in a single exposure. So in this setting, DR100 basically means it's turned off. The camera just keeps things as is. DR200 gives you 1 extra stop of highlight protection, while DR400 gives you 2 stops of extra highlight protection. Remember that a RAW file captures the camera's unprocessed sensor data. So to understand how the dynamic range setting affects those RAW files, you need to better understand what's happening inside your camera. In order for these dynamic range settings to work, your camera has to raise the minimum ISO that it's allowed to use. So for example, the minimum base ISO on a Fujifilm X-T5 is 125. But if you set the dynamic range to DR200, the minimum ISO now allowed is 250. For DR400, the minimum is 500. So let's say you're shooting in aperture priority on an X-T5 and your DR setting is 100%. Now, if you decide to change it to, say, 400%, the camera is now going to require a minimum ISO of 500. But here's the thing, ISO 500 is 2 stops more sensitive to light than ISO 125. So with the higher ISO, the camera needs less light to make a properly exposed shot. And because you have locked your aperture, remember we set it in aperture priority, the only way to give the camera less light is for it to use a faster shutter speed. Here's the part that throws people, okay? Raising the ISO sounds like you're making the sensor more sensitive to light, which should in theory make highlights clip more easily and not less. But the sensor itself does not actually change. What changes is the camera's metering behavior. At higher ISO, the meter knows, it already knows this, that it can get the correct exposure with less overall light. So in aperture priority, it picks a faster shutter speed to deliver that less light. The end result is a RAW file recorded with 2 stops less exposure than you would have gotten at DR100. The DR setting becomes just metadata that is embedded in your RAW file. Here is the EXIF data from a RAW file. Watch what happens when we look at one that has DR400. Check this out. Look how it says development dynamic range 400. So the specific setting that you put for DR100 or 400 is right in the metadata inside the RAW file. But there's a lot more to this. Let me show you something very interesting here. So for this demo, I shot 2 photos on my X-T5. And what I did was I spot metered the exposure right on the color chart. That's my subject. And the camera's built-in light meter is showing the scene exposed at 0, a perfect exposure according to the camera. What I also did was I simulated a very bright background area right here. That's a lot brighter than the subject, which is the color chart, which the camera is metering as the correct exposure right here. So the camera is exposing for this color chart. So what I did was I shot 2 photos on my X-T5. For each photo, I set the camera to aperture priority, and I set my aperture to exactly f7.1 for both shots. Both my ISO and my shutter speed were set to automatic. And for my auto ISO on both shots, I chose default sensitivity to ISO 125 and a minimum shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. That's not the important part. Let me show you that now. As you can see, my exposure meter for my spot area right here is perfectly evened out at 0. But the important thing is right here, DR100. Remember that at DR100 basically means it's turned off and the camera is not applying any kind of dynamic range adjustment. So I went ahead and I took the first photo. For the second photo, the only change I made was to choose DR400. Now watch the settings the camera changed the minute I did that. It bumped up the ISO to that minimum of 500, which you need for DR400. And because of that extra ISO sensitivity headroom, it increased the shutter speed to 1/220th of a second. And so I took the second shot with these exact settings right here. Here we are looking at the first photo I took, the raw file, in Capture One. For this shot, I had taken it with the DR setting on the X-T5 at 100%, which means basically it was turned off. No highlight protection was enabled, and the camera exposed the scene normally. And of course, that exposure was bright enough to clip this piece of paper right here. Very little, if not any detail. Now, here's the same shot with the only change made that I had set the camera to DR400. Again, we're looking at the raw file, same aperture, but the camera had selected automatically a faster shutter speed because of the forced higher ISO based on the setting of DR400. And as you can see, the highlight has been more preserved because the sensor, never saw enough light to actually clip it. Now, here's something else that a lot of Fujifilm shooters are not aware of. This DR400 file that you're looking at right now has even more highlight detail than what's being displayed. You see, Capture One is rendering this image in what is called the auto curve. And basically what auto curve means is that Capture One is applying a Fujifilm style film simulation tone curve. And it's this tone curve that is adding contrast and an aggressive highlight roll-off. Watch what happens though when I switch the curve from auto to linear response. There is now even more detail visible. Remember, that data was always in the raw file, but the automatic curve applied by Capture One was just compressing those highlights tightly to give you, a more punchy image. Linear response, however, shows the same data, but with less compression. But this raw file gets even stranger when you open it in Lightroom. So have a look at this right here. The raw file on the left is DR100, the raw file on the right, DR400. Both of them have blown highlights, as you can see, and they look almost identical. But remember, in Capture One, they looked very different. You see that right here? And so in Lightroom, the DR400 raw file is not showing the recovered highlight detail that we just saw in Capture One. What is going on here? Both Capture One and Lightroom read the dynamic range metadata that's been embedded in your raw file. You see that right here? And both are applying a brightness compensation. However, they are applying it differently. Capture One uses sort of an official Fujifilm-style tone curve that lifts the entire image while protecting the highlights with sort of a gentle roll-off, whereas Lightroom applies a flat, linear lift across the entire image. Every single tone gets pushed up by exactly 2 stops. And so the highlight detail that you had saved by shooting at DR400 looks like, at least when you open up the raw file in Lightroom, it looks like it's gone. But it's not. The data is still there in your raw file. And what's happening is that Lightroom's automatic compensation is just pushing it right back to where it would have been had it been at DR100 in the first place. Watch this. I'll go to my DR400 raw file right here, and I'll pull down my exposure slider by 2 stops on the DR400 raw file. And you can see that it's been there the whole time. There is detail, there is texture. It's just been that Lightroom has been hiding it under its own automatic exposure lift. Have a look at this right here. If you're dealing with JPEG, here's the DR100 versus 400 in JPEG. The JPEG with DR400 that was processed by the Fujifilm camera before saving to the SD card definitely recovered more of the highlights. And if I try and turn it down by 2 stops, you do get quite a bit of detail here. But watch what happens if I try the same thing with the DR100, turning it down by 2 stops. It's not even a close call, which is why I say shoot in both JPEG and RAW, because if you had done this in a JPEG, you cannot get it back. It doesn't save all that extra sensor data. And as you can see side by side, opening up a raw DR400 file in Capture One automatically by default recovers much of the highlight as as it can, whereas the automatic compensation in Lightroom will hide it. But remember, the data's still there. You just need to use the exposure slider in Lightroom to bring it back. But the bottom line is this: the Fujifilm DR setting genuinely changes your RAW file, but not by modifying the sensor data. The camera just captures the scene with less light, forcing a higher ISO, which causes the camera to compensate with either a faster shutter speed if you're shooting in aperture priority, or a smaller aperture if you're shooting in shutter priority. And a really important point I want you to remember is that the software that you use makes a dramatic difference in what you see when you first open your RAW file. Same data, but two completely different results. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found the video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, be sure to give it the like and subscribe. I will see you in a new video very soon. Take care.